Thank you everyone for joining. We'll be starting in just 1 minute so we can start letting some participants in. As you all are coming in, if you can please type in the chat box where you're joining us from either your city and state, so that way we know who is joining us. That'd be great. Thank you. Fantastic. It seems like we're getting people from all over the US, which is fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're very excited to be able to share some information on accessing emergency housing vouchers. That we want to really tailor today's webinar to anti-trafficking providers and how you can be a part of ensuring that survivors of human trafficking have access to these emergency housing vouchers. So today we have the great pleasure of having Carlo, Renee, and Caroline, who are going to be sharing both on the logistics, but also on ideas of how to ensure that you have partnerships and also how you as a service provider can best work with your continuums of care and your public housing authority to make sure that survivors have access. So today we have Carlo Ng. She is with the National Alliance for Safe Housing. We're very excited to have her. We also have Renee Williams with the National Housing Law Project and Carolyn Krause with HUD. And they'll be both presenting and sharing some remarks up front, as well as we'll have some Q&A. So you'll see at the bottom of your screen, if we can go to the next slide, you'll have some options. One of the options that you have is a Q&A. If you can enter your questions there, that'll allow us to keep those questions all in one place and make sure we get them answered. They'll either be answered throughout the presentation itself, and like I mentioned, we'll have a Q&A portion at the end, so we'll be able to get to those questions that you all have. Also, we do have closed captioning, so if you hit that green, that CC button and it goes green, you'll be able to see the closed captioning there, and so you're welcome to use that to be able to read the transcript. And then finally, if you have any outside of questions, if you want to share any examples, you're welcome to use the chat for that as well. So that way we have, the information that you all want to share with us. We want to make sure that this feels like a conversation. We know that for anti-trafficking programs, it's not continuums of care or public housing authorities may be familiar to you, or this may be a new relationship that you're starting. So we want to make sure we also hear from you all how this experience is going. We're going to go ahead and go to the next slide. Yeah, today's webinar is being brought to you by the Freedom Network Training Institute, the Housing Training and Technical Assistance Project, funded under the Office for Victims of Crime. So we hold quarterly webinars on intersections of housing and human trafficking. Obviously, the emergency housing vouchers are a great resource for survivors, and we want to make sure we covered that. Those are always uploaded into our resource library that you can find at freedomnetworkusa.org. And we can also provide one-on-one training and technical assistance. So if you have any questions around both, whether it be emergency housing vouchers, specifically around human trafficking, or any questions that you may have around models or best resources for housing survivors, feel free to reach out to us at training@freedomnetworkusa.org. And we'll have that information on the last slide, so no need to worry. We are recording today's webinar, and so you'll have a follow-up email in the next 2 weeks with the recording, with the slides, and also any resources that we mentioned, you'll have those attached there. So just know that those are going to be coming your way. You can go ahead and go to the next slide. Perfect. Now I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Caroline, and she'll share some remarks with us.
Hi, Karen. Thanks so much for introducing me and inviting me to be here. I'm so excited to be here. Can everyone hear me? I'm hoping. Great. So I'm here from HUD. I work in the Office of Special Needs Assistance Programs in HUD, working on partnerships with public housing authorities and blanking on the word CoCs, Continuums of Care. Just sad. I work on the program all the time and I forgot the name. Victim service providers, CoCs, and PHAs, or public housing authorities, all share a common goal of providing safe and affordable housing to people in their community. The Emergency Housing Voucher program is working to create collaborations between these partners and other stakeholders in communities to collaboratively work across systems to help effectively address the housing needs of survivors impacted by housing instability. Together, they can build safer communities and healthier families while preventing and ending violence within families and communities. I want to give a really brief overview of what the Emergency Housing Voucher program will, how it operates in communities. So the program is approximately 70,000 vouchers to about 700 public housing authorities across the United States, including territories. There are 4 eligible categories of people who can, of individuals and families who can receive the vouchers: people experiencing homelessness, people at risk of homelessness, those fleeing or attempting to flee domestic violence, dating violence, stalking, and human trafficking, and individuals and families who are formerly homeless. So when a family receives a voucher, the voucher allows them to look for private housing in the community that meets the what's called housing quality standards. It has to be a certain level of, it has to be decent, safe, and sanitary. Basically, the family is required to pay 30% of their income towards rent every month, and then the housing authority or the voucher covers the difference between what that 30% of their income would be and the full amount of rent for the program. So essentially, it helps open up a large amount of housing to people that perhaps would not have been able to afford it. The Emergency Housing Voucher program has some very special parts about it that I think make it particularly good for the community that we're, for people that are fleeing domestic violence or human trafficking victims. The Emergency Housing Vouchers were authorized under the American Rescue Plan, and it allows HUD to waive or specify alternative requirements for provisions under the United States Housing Act that are usually in place for the Housing Choice Voucher program, which is sometimes called the Section 8 program. The Emergency Housing Voucher program is based on the laws and regulations from the Section 8 Housing Choice Voucher program, but there are these key differences that allow it to be a little bit more responsive to the eligible populations for the Emergency Housing Voucher programs. So the notice, which is Notice PIH 2021-15, outlines waivers and alternative requirements for the administration of the vouchers that HUD has adopted. PHAs can and should utilize these waivers to make EHV more accessible to survivors by eliminating, where possible, the standard screening criteria part of existing PHA policies, such as income verification, criminal background checks, or rental history checks. Victim service providers and culturally specific organizations can provide valuable insight to the barriers to housing stability that they see with their clients, which they should share with public housing authorities and other partners within that who are helping to stand up the EHV program, in order to ensure that the program is as accessible to victims and survivors as possible. I'm here for questions. I'm really excited to interact with you a little later. I did want to just touch on one more thing. If you are having issues, so I should say the vouchers are also acting a little bit differently because the public housing authorities are required to take referrals from partners in order to fill the vouchers. For the most part, we're recommending that housing authorities partner with their continuums of care to get those referrals from the coordinated entry system. In many communities, there are really strong ties between victim service providers and the continuums of care. However, we know that's not the case in every community, and it may be at different levels of partnership, depending on where you are with your partnerships. So if you are having any problems or have questions about how to make connections with your COC or your PHA, I think the first place to stop is the EHV mailbox. It's ehv@hud.gov, and I'll put this in the chat window as well. That's a mailbox that's monitored by HUD headquarters, and we can help connect you to HUD field office staff as well as other resources in your communities for working on those partnerships. So again, I'll put a couple of resources in the chat, but really excited to see the next presenters. Next slide, please.
Thank you so much, Caroline. I'm Renee Williams from the National Housing Law Project. Folks are asking really good questions in the chat, and I made a valiant attempt to start responding to them. But keep them coming, because I think they really help shape the conversation and where questions are in the field. So I'm really happy to be here. I'm going to take the first few slides and then pass it on to Carlo. So Caroline covered a lot of these initial slides, but just so we're all on the same page. So when we're talking about emergency housing vouchers, as Caroline mentioned, they're very similar in a lot of ways to housing choice vouchers, but there are important differences as well. And later on in the presentation, we're going to walk through some of those differences and distinctions. One particularly important part that Caroline mentioned are the waivers. And because we really feel like these waivers and alternative requirements are going to be really important for helping expand access to folks who maybe under the historic housing choice voucher program may have had some admissions barriers, for example. And so, so we're going to talk about those. But I think, in terms of some of the architecture and program requirements, you can kind of start with the assumption that a lot of the requirements, map the Section 8 Housing Choice Voucher Program, and then we'll talk about the distinctions. That might be the best way to sort of wrap our heads around EHVs, but there are some really important differences, as we'll talk about. But some of the similarities are, again, you're going to have PHAs, local public housing agencies, administering the vouchers themselves. And as Caroline mentioned, continuums of care, or in certain circumstances, victim service providers are going to be really important because they're going to help determine eligibility for these vouchers. And then the housing authority is going to pick up and actually administer the vouchers, similar to what they do in the Housing Choice Voucher Program. Caroline also mentioned, this is going to be about leasing up in the private market, which is helpful in that, survivors are able to figure out what location is safest for them and use that voucher on the private market. So, again, some of the waivers that I believe we're going to talk about in alternative requirements are also designed to ensure that, survivors are going to be able to not only be admitted to the voucher program to get one of these emergency vouchers, but also help them with respect to payment standards and those types of things in terms of the level of subsidy that the voucher will provide to really try to facilitate them being successful in the private market. And again, it's a mobile rental subsidy, so we're not talking about subsidies that are tied to a particular unit. We are talking about subsidy that moves with the client or program participant. Oh, there we go. Sorry, I'm having a little bit of an issue advancing the slides. Okay, I will just go from here. So in terms of who qualifies for emergency housing vouchers, so Caroline mentioned there are 4 categories of folks, and this is all laid out in the notice that Caroline mentioned, 2021-15. So these are individuals and families. Somebody in the questions asked, is it for families and individuals? Thank you, Caroline, for dropping in the notice. And there's also a really helpful Q&A as well. So in terms of individuals and families, somebody asked, if it was for one or the others, for both. And the categories are fleeing or attempting to flee domestic violence, sexual assault, dating violence, stalking, or human trafficking. So the first tranche of definitions, domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, and stalking, those definitions are taken from the VAWA 2013 housing, or VAWA 2013 just general statute which includes important housing protections for survivors. But the definitions in terms of what is domestic violence, what is sexual assault, those are going to be the definitions that apply to the whole law. So those are valid 2013, and then as on the slide, and particularly relevant for this conversation today, is that the definition of human trafficking is going to be the definition from the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000. So those are the operational definitions that we're working with. Then there are also additional categories of individuals who are experiencing homelessness, at risk of experiencing homelessness. Those are McKinney-Vento Act definitions, and the 2015 notice that Caroline dropped in the chat lays out and reminds us what those definitions are. And then there's also recently homeless, which HUD defines in the 2021-15 notice. And it's basically folks where getting the voucher would prevent the individual or family from becoming homelessness or from having a high degree of housing instability. So the notice provides a couple of examples, like folks in publicly supported housing or rapid rehousing. Those folks would likely fall within this category. So in terms of the income qualifications, so this is an area where, you know, it's going to be very similar to the voucher program. And so, you know, your local PHA is going to be applying similar income qualifications to the Emergency Housing Voucher program. So that's going to be very similar. Immigration is also an area that is similar. I know that somebody had a question in the chat about immigration status requirements. So a couple of things. So one, the eligibility is going to map, it's going to be the same as it is for the Housing Choice Voucher program. So, you know, it includes folks who are US citizens and nationals, lawful permanent residents, VAWA self-petitioners, also qualified victims of trafficking, including T visa holders, are included in that category of folks who are eligible to access emergency housing vouchers. If folks have questions about that, we can definitely, Carlo is definitely an expert. We can talk more about that during the Q&A. One also important point to note, and just remember that the changes to the mixed status rule did not go through. So we're still in this framework of prorated housing assistance, if not everybody in the household has eligible immigration status. Next slide, please. Or I'm doing the slides. Okay. So now we can talk a little bit about what's different about how the EHVs. So Caroline already mentioned this, and you know, this is a change that housing authorities are required to work with the CoCs, and as well, you know, particularly if the CoCs are not, for example, serving survivors, then you know, there's also homeless services and victim service provider organizations as referral partners. So all of these organizations and entities have an important role. And what the framework is that the CoCs primarily, it's going to be the CoCs, and in places where the CoCs are not really able to do this, victim service providers or homeless service provider organizations are going to determine the eligibility of the 4 categories that are on the previous slide. Homeless service, people experiencing homelessness, survivors, etc. So that determination is going to be made by the CoC, as well as, you know, potentially other referral partners. Anti-trafficking organizations, you know, can be included in this. And so, you know, for folks who are working with survivors of trafficking, you know, it's really important for folks on this call to get involved, to try and reach out to the local CoC, or just try to figure out where your local housing authority is and just make sure that you're involved in the conversation. These relationships, HUD is requiring that housing authorities and Continuum of Care enter into Memoranda of Understanding, and that process is sort of happening right now in terms of the Memoranda of Understanding being developed. In this notice, the 2021-15 notice, HUD provided a template for a Memorandum of Understanding, and this document is really important because it's going to delineate what roles the various entities are going to play in administering the emergency housing vouchers. Next slide, please. There we go. I keep forgetting if I'm doing the slides or not. My last slide is what is different. So, what are we talking about with some of these distinctions around emergency housing vouchers? So the first thing, and it's a really big and important change, is that there's a $3,500 services fee per voucher. So I noted before, there are some changes and tweaks to the EHV program to really make it so that survivors are able to successfully lease up, right? Folks in the Housing Choice Voucher program oftentimes encounter a lot of barriers, as do survivors, right? As do the clients that you serve. So there's some really, really important eligible uses and requirements. So one is housing search assistance. And this is so important, particularly, for survivors who, need some guidance, in terms of being able to successfully lease up. Not every jurisdiction in the country has source of income protections. So that kind of adds another layer, right? There may be private housing providers who don't accept vouchers. And so that's really where the housing assistance is going to become really valuable. And housing authorities can actually contract with victim service providers to do this. Another really important point, and for folks who are leaving abusive situations, survivors oftentimes don't have that security deposit, right? They, because of economic abuse and coercion, they, oftentimes don't have that security deposit. So this is an eligible use for that part of that 3,500 is to provide security deposit. A lot of private housing providers, right, have a rental application fee, or, some of this funding can be used to actually hold the unit so that the landlord, the private landlord, doesn't feel like they're losing money by renting to an emergency housing voucher holder, right? Because as Caroline mentioned, there's some inspection that has to happen because these units have to be safe, decent, and sanitary. Also, really important potential use, and, folks who are on the line, who are working with their local housing authorities, have an understanding of the need, right? Some places you really need a lot of landlord recruitment because there might not be source of income protections, for example. So that's also another eligible use. Also incentives for landlords, retention payments. So again, using these funds to really help survivors be able to successfully lease up and stay in the program. Other eligible uses, and again, these are not required, but these are within the housing authority's discretion to use that $3,500 per voucher fee that they're getting to fund some of these expenses. So moving expenses, also really important, right? Moving is expensive, and a lot of times survivors, don't have that money saved up. Renter's insurance, a lot of private landlords require renter's insurance, which can be costly. Essential household items like furniture, as well as tenant readiness services. So particularly for folks who have just had a lot of difficulties and are, putting, going back out on the private housing market just to get them prepared to be successful in the EHV program. And now I'm going to turn it over to Carlo.
Hi, everyone. This is Carlo Ng, Director of Legal Initiatives at NASH. Thanks so much for all the questions that are coming in. We are feverishly trying to answer your questions in the chat box while also trying to answer them verbally, because I know there were some points that we're covering and folks have questions about. And Renee, if you could just do me a favor, anyone else who's monitoring the chat box, if you want to just stop me at any point for me to provide further clarification because people have questions about something I'm talking about, just stop me. That might be easier than trying to put something in the chat box. And also I know some of folks are just calling in, and so for folks who are calling in, they can't actually they can't read the chat box. Okay, well, thank you so much, Renee. So what else is different? Caroline and Renee mentioned that there are a variety of waivers that are associated with the emergency housing vouchers. The program is based on the Section 8 Housing Choice Voucher program, but it is different in many respects. And the takeaway, I think, is really flexibility. HUD in their notice made it really clear that they're trying to make this program as flexible and as accessible as possible to the populations that these vouchers are designed to serve. And certainly one of the populations are survivors of human trafficking, domestic violence, and sexual assault. And so as part of that notice, you see that there are many, many big items that are quite different from the Housing Choice Voucher program. And so there were a few questions about waiting lists in the chat box. People are concerned that because in their jurisdiction, there is a really long waiting list for housing choice vouchers. In some areas, it's as long as 5 to 7 years. And so because of that, because HUD is aware of that, for this housing choice voucher, for this emergency voucher program, what HUD has said is that the waiting list for the emergency vouchers will be completely different. It will be a brand new waiting list that PHAs will have that will be separate from the housing choice voucher waiting list. So the housing authorities will have to create a new waiting list for these vouchers. Folks who are currently on the housing choice voucher waiting list will be notified of potentially being able to apply for the emergency vouchers if they qualify and they fall within one of the eligibility categories, but it is a brand new waiting list. There's also some other sort of reporting and monitoring and financing requirements that are also completely separate from the Housing Choice Voucher program. Another point that is different from the Housing Choice Voucher program is that the Emergency Voucher program cannot have any local residency preferences. So for some of you who might be familiar with the Housing Choice Voucher program or Section 8 program in your area, you might be aware that the housing authority probably has some kind of residency preference. So these are preferences that basically create a priority for folks who are applying who either live and or work in the jurisdiction that the housing authority covers. And so that preference gives them a slight bump up in the waiting list so that they can be further at the top of the waiting list, which we all know are really generally very long period of time that folks have to wait for. And so in this situation, HUD has said that housing authorities cannot have local residency preferences. And again, that requirement is to really increase the flexibility so that folks from other jurisdictions who are applying for the emergency vouchers will be able to apply for the vouchers so long as they are meet up the eligibility requirements. And again, there's no sort of those residency barriers and challenges that face the Housing Choice Voucher program. There's also some restrictions on denials of assistance. So as for folks who are familiar with the Housing Choice Voucher program, you're probably also aware that there are many different bases for prohibitions that could make someone ineligible for a Housing Choice Voucher. And so what HUD has said here is that essentially most of those prohibitions are gone. There are essentially two mandatory prohibitions. One is if the person has manufactured or distributed methamphetamine on the premises of federal housing, then that would disqualify someone from assistance completely. The other basis is if the person is a registered sex offender, then that would also automatically disqualify that person from an emergency voucher. So those are the only two mandatory prohibitions. There are some permissive basis for prohibitions, but again, they're permissive. And if a housing authority were to actually deny assistance based on any of those permissive bases, they actually have to engage in an individual assessment to see whether or not there are some mitigating factors that would actually help the applicant to qualify for the voucher. So again, the name of the game is really to figure out how to help folks be eligible for the vouchers and get rid of some of these sort of historic barriers and challenges that have really prevented some of these populations from accessing voucher assistance. There are also a number of bases for prohibitions that are completely not allowed. They're allowed in the Section 8 Housing Choice Voucher Program, but they are not allowed for purposes of the emergency voucher. We're not going to talk about all these prohibitions today just because there's not enough time, but you should know that for folks who are working with survivors, some of those unallowable prohibitions include bases such as, if the survivor owes rent to the housing authority, if they owe them fees because of property damages, all of those bases are not allowed as a reason for a human trafficking survivor or other survivor to not be able to access the program. So again, this is very, very different from the Section 8 program. There's also quite a bit of flexibility when it comes to documentation and verifying income, as well as immigration status and social security numbers. So Renee talked about some of the qualifications regarding income and immigration status, but in terms of documentation, for income purposes, HUD has said that you can self-certify, and that self-certification is the highest form of verification for purposes of verifying income. So essentially, you could have an affidavit that has some information on there verifying income and other assets, and that's completely fine. For immigration status and social security numbers, if the applicant does not have the documentation reflecting that they have the eligible immigration status or they're US citizens up front, that's okay. HUD has said that the applicant has up to 180 days to provide this verification or documentation. So that's true of the immigration status as well as the social security number. So that's quite a bit of time. That's up to 6 months that applicants have. And so that is very different, again, from the Housing Choice Voucher Program. Next slide, please. Here are also some other things that are very different about the Emergency Voucher Program. I should know that everything we're saying today this is not an exhaustive list of the waivers. There are quite a few more waivers, and if you want more information, please definitely read the notice that is implementing the operating requirements for the Emergency Voucher Program. We're just highlighting sort of some of the big ticket items, but there are many other details that you should be aware of. And obviously, if you have more questions, we're happy to answer them today. But as part of the Emergency Voucher Program, housing authorities also have the ability to establish a higher payment standard. So a payment standard is basically a standard that HUD uses to determine essentially how much subsidy to provide to a family who has received voucher assistance. And oftentimes that payment standard reflects the housing costs in the area. But the issue is that with the Section 8 program, a housing authority, in order to provide a higher payment standard or provide a higher subsidy to a family, they would have to actually petition to HUD and get a waiver, and that could take some time before that payment standard could be changed. But in this program, the housing authorities can go ahead and establish the higher payment standard without going through that whole process with HUD, which is really great because what we have found is often payment standards don't reflect higher housing costs in certain areas, and so it's good that housing authorities can make those adjustments on their own. There's also a change in terms of the initial search term. So after a family gets a voucher, the family then has to go into the private housing market in order to find a unit to use the voucher in, and then a landlord who will accept the voucher and be part of the voucher program. And so what often happens is that a family could wait quite a long time to get voucher assistance. They're really excited that they got the voucher assistance from the housing authority, and then they go on to the private market, and very unfortunately, they can't find a unit within the period of time that they have to search for a unit to use the voucher in. And so for the normal Section 8 voucher program, families usually have about 60 days, and that 60 days can be renewed depending at the discretion of the housing authority. But a lot of families are not able to find housing in those 60 days. And so renewals happen quite often and quite frequently. And even with the renewals, many families cannot find units where the landlord will take the voucher and allow them to stay there with the assistance. So HUD recognize that, and so they've doubled the time that families have in the initial period to find a unit to use the voucher in. So it's 120 days, and that 120 days is also subject to renewal according to the Housing Authority's policies about renewals for search terms. The initial lease term for these vouchers, the emergency vouchers, can also be less than 12 months. So in the normal Section 8 program, the initial lease term almost always has to be 12 months, no exceptions. But what HUD is saying here is they're really acknowledging the fact that the folks that these vouchers are designed to serve are going to need a lot of flexibility, whether it's a survivor who needs to move within a couple of months for safety reasons, or because the person who received the voucher needs to be in another kind of housing situation because of their personal needs, that this kind of assistant needs to be flexible and also needs to be mobile with the person who receives the assistance. So the initial lease term does not have to be 12 months. It can be less than 12 months, and that's okay. So I've already started talking about portability, or the ability for someone to take the assistance and move. Because this is voucher assistance, there is that mobility characteristic that's attached to the voucher. So the family or the individual who gets the voucher can definitely take the voucher with them and move if, again, they're moving for safety reasons, or if they have other personal reasons and need to port to another jurisdiction that's covered by another housing authority, so long as that housing authority will absorb that voucher. And they can do that anytime during the first year that they get the assistance. In the regular Section 8 voucher program, there's a restriction on that. The regular Section 8 voucher program says you have to stay within our jurisdiction within the first year. You can't move out of our jurisdiction. You can't go anywhere with it in order to continue to qualify for the assistance. That's not true with emergency vouchers. The families who get these vouchers can go ahead and move anytime during the first year, and that's okay. And just one final point about these emergency vouchers, because they are COVID vouchers, there's this deadline of September 30th, 2023, that is part of the statute. And that deadline basically, let me take a step back. For anyone who is issued these vouchers, say they're issued right now, if they continue to use them, they can continue to renew them year after year, and it's totally fine, well past 2023. And they can continue to use these vouchers just like in the Section 8 Housing Choice Voucher Assistance Program. That's not a problem. The only issue is for some reason, the family decides they no longer need the voucher is terminated, and at the time that they terminate, it's after September 30th, 2023, then that voucher that is terminated after September 30th, 2023 cannot be reissued to a new family. So again, that deadline is because of the fact that these are supposed to be COVID vouchers and that they don't go back into the system. And so if they're terminated, they'll just disappear. But that only applies to vouchers that have been issued. If it's a brand new voucher, it's never been issued to a family, then they still remain in the pot and can be used. Okay, next slide. Okay, so what roles can you play? So the deadlines related to the emergency vouchers are coming up quickly. In the FAQs that accompany the HUD guidance around the emergency vouchers, there is the official MOU deadline of July 31st. So this is the deadline that housing authorities have to enter into MOUs. But what HUD is really encouraging and what we're really seeing on the ground is that housing authorities are really looking at July 1st as a deadline to get an executable MOU in place. So we're really looking at less than a month. And so we're really encouraging folks who work, victim service providers and other folks who work with survivors to contact their continuums of care, as well as their housing authority as soon as possible. There are different roles that you can play here. Establishing a partnership for direct referrals, we've talked about that several times already, for emergency vouchers is definitely a priority. If you already have a relationship with your housing authority or COC, for sure, this would be a wonderful way to continue that partnership. But even if you haven't, we've been working with a couple of housing authorities who have never worked with victim service providers. They're eager to work with them, and then also COCs who are also eager to work with sexual assault and trafficking providers and culturally specific victim service organizations. So making sure that those kinds of programs and organizations are also part of the direct referrals. We're encouraging people to reach out to their COCs first to see if they can be integrated into the existing coordinated entry system that the COC has, or if there's some other alternative system that is being used by the domestic violence providers and domestic violence survivors, that we highly encourage you to try to get integrated into that system. And if for some reason that doesn't work, then to also reach out to housing authorities directly to get an MOU with them. And if you experience any kind of troubles in terms of reaching out to PHAs or COCs, you know, definitely email HUD at the website, at the email address that Caroline provided to try to connect with a HUD local office. You can also reach out to us and we can try to provide you with some of those referrals as well. Another place where victim service providers can be really helpful is also by helping COCs as well as PHAs figure out how to prioritize in terms of distributing emergency vouchers. You know, what we found is that, you know, there are quite a few COCs and housing authorities that might not be aware of the housing needs of survivors and how exactly that should be prioritized as compared to other folks who might be experiencing homelessness. And you all, as the experts on serving survivors, would definitely have that information and data, and that would be really, really crucial and invaluable for COCs and PHAs now. Let's see. There are other opportunities to support COCs and PHAs as well. I think some folks have already talked about providing housing search assistance as well as providing supportive services. It's going to be really critical for victim services providers to be involved in the beginning of this process, not only in terms of helping survivors access the vouchers, but also to help them maintain the vouchers. And for organizations locally that have been doing this work for a long time, it'll be really great to work with COCs and PHAs to make sure that that support continues with survivors even after they've received the voucher assistance. It'll be really important to make sure that COCs and PHAs are ensuring that how the emergency voucher program is low barrier, and also that it considers issues of confidentiality. So the HUD notice makes it really clear that the program is supposed to be low barrier. The referral process is supposed to be very flexible, not create any challenges. It's supposed to be really direct. What the notice doesn't really talk about so much is confidentiality, especially when it comes to issues involving survivors and the incidents of violence that they may have experienced. And so it's going to be really important for victim service providers to really ensure that whatever process is developed in terms of the referrals, certification forms, that all that information that gets provided to COCs or PHAs or gets shared in a way that really respects the confidentiality of the survivor. Next slide, please. Okay, so again, contacting your COCs and PHAs as soon as possible is going to be really important, and definitely starting with Continuums of Care first, seeing if you can integrate into the coordinated entry system, identifying any gaps and creating partnerships to assist voucher holders. There is the website, I also put it in the chat, that's HUD's website for the emergency housing vouchers. I included in here a link to a letter. This was an advocacy letter that the New York City's Continuum of Care domestic violence co-chairs sent to the New York City Continuum of Care Steering Committee co-chairs. And I concluded it because it's the only one that I'm aware of that was sent, this is a couple of weeks ago now, when the DV folks became aware that these vouchers were going to come down the pipe very soon. And so they were essentially trying to make the case that DV survivors should definitely be prioritized. They provided some information about how survivors in their locality in New York City, that even though they overrepresent so many folks in shelters, in terms of people who ultimately get permanent affordable housing, it represents a very small percentage. I think it's a single-digit percentage. And so because of that, that reflected a big need to really make sure that survivors are accessing these vouchers. So they also provided information about how to prioritize based on the percentage of survivors, DV survivors specifically, that make up the homelessness system. In New York City, it's 41%. And so they argue that it should be 41%. Now, I know in terms of prioritization, it's going to get a little bit harder for populations where there might not be as much data about housing needs, like trafficking survivors and sexual assault survivors. But whatever data that you do have that you think could be helpful to advocate with the providers is going to be, with the CoCs and PHAs, is going to be really important. In the letter, the New York folks also explain why the existing coordinated entry assessment does not appropriately provide placement assistance for survivors. And so they also talk about an alternative way that victim service providers could be included if they are not included as referral partners. So if you want to take a look at it, next slide, please. The link is on the next slide. It just gives you a good sense of how one jurisdiction is advocating for these vouchers. And I think that even though it's domestic violence focused, it could be used for other survivor populations as well. So on this slide is we also partnered with a couple of our colleagues and created a guidance for victim service providers around emergency vouchers that outline essentially, what roles you can play, what that means, gives you a summary of the emergency vouchers as well. And there's also a template, which we are in the midst of finalizing. It's not quite final right now, but someone in the chat did have a question about whether or not there is a template that we have for victim service providers who are referral agencies that they could use for housing authorities. So this is what we came up with, which is based on HUD's certification template. Next slide, I believe that's the last slide. So that's our contact information.
Fantastic, thank you. So we have a lot of questions that have come in, and for those that are just joining us through audio, there have been a lot of questions and answers that have been added to the chat box as well as the Q&A box. So I will try to re-share those verbally so that way everyone's getting the information. But I will say that one of the questions that has been coming up is around how many vouchers were provided via any one public housing authority. And there is a list of those that were awarded under the website hud.gov/EHV. And we put that in the chat. So if you click on that, you go over to the left-hand side, you'll see a number of links in blue. You'll just want to go to the list of EHV awardees. And that way you can see, which were awarded, and that way you can also connect with them. It also has a link to find your public housing authority. So that way you have that easy access there. So we're going to go ahead and start with questions that came in through the chat box and the Q&A box. We also got a bunch of questions through the registration. And so bear with us as we try to make it through as many as we can. Any questions that we're not able to get through, we'll compile them in a document for you all as we send it out with the recording, with the slides, in a follow-up email. So we'll just make sure that you have that information available. So the first question is around the leasing. So does the lease need to be in the name of the participant, or can it be in the name of the supporting agency? So I'll start off with Carlo, if you have any thoughts around that.
I feel like that might be a good question for HUD. Caroline, feel free to jump in.
And I'll add a little context, Caroline. For a lot of survivors, oftentimes it's hard to lease up because of the requirements that are often placed by, the private landlord or just the landlord in general. What we've seen as an area of success is that some of the anti-trafficking organizations will lease under their name, so that way they're able to get that easy access, and then hopefully eventually being able to transfer the lease under the individual's name. So Caroline, there's some context, so I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Thanks. Yeah, unfortunately, under the housing choice voucher regulations, so the lease has to be between the individual or family and the landlord. So we don't do sponsor-based leasing or rental assistance within the housing choice voucher program.
Thank you. The next question is around what standard of evidence will be required to show that an individual is a survivor of human trafficking. So if you have an organization who might be serving survivors of labor or sex trafficking and they screen them, is that sufficient? What does that look like? And Carla, I'll turn it over to you for that one.
Well, I think what the HUD notice makes really clear is that it has to be extremely low barrier. If you look at the template that they provide at the back of the notice, it's on the very bottom. So keep on scrolling if you're looking at the notice. Some people missed it. All it basically saying is that they essentially meet the definition of human trafficking under TVPA, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, and that's all. It's a box that they check. There's some additional lines about asking them about their housing situation beforehand. But honestly, Caroline, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't actually think that's needed in terms of making sure that survivors are eligible for the program. I think that has more to do with the homelessness definition. So, it's very basic.
Can I jump in just really quick, because there was a lot of conversation in the chat, and I just want to clarify. So, and Carlo, Karen, Caroline, help me out if I'm not making sense. So I mentioned T visas as, in the context of Section 214, but a T visa is not required for the purposes of the emergency housing voucher. And so those are sort of two separate trains of thought, in that, I just wanted to clarify that under Section 214, right, victims of trafficking are one of the populations that are eligible for HUD housing programs, including the voucher program and EHV, but there's no requirement that there be a T visa issued to actually get this. Is that consistent with everyone's I just want to make sure that I'm stating that correctly.
Yeah, and there was actually a question on that specifically if they had to have a T visa approval or at least received a notice of action. So that's great clarification. I think jumping on that is also, there was a question, I believe, either in the chat box or the Q&A around HHS certification. And so people that have received HHS certification for human trafficking, they are eligible for public benefits, similar to somebody that would have refugee status, which allows them to enter public housing. So they would be eligible as well. And to reference back on that certification that Carlo was mentioning, that's an example or a sample of certification. It's actually specific to human trafficking, which, that works well for us. All to say that we really encourage you as a direct service provider, as you're working with Continuums of Care and, or with PHAs directly, is that you can, as you're approaching them, suggest, that you work as a referral partner, that you work in order to provide that certification, because we already know that the amount of work that you all are doing, especially at intake and assessment, that is sufficient, and oftentimes when it's replicated or duplicated, it ends up being re-traumatizing. So it does make sense for victim service providers, specifically in human trafficking, to support in that way. And the certification that you'll see, or that sample, it allows you as the victim service provider to say, Karen, have been working with this individual, you sign it, and it allows you to say, to the best of my knowledge, they are a survivor of trafficking. So it really minimizes the barriers of a survivor having to self-identify and say, oh, yes, I do identify as a survivor of trafficking, to someone that's not a victim service provider. So I would just really encourage you to look at that and to take, just knowledge of that and leverage that tool. The next question that I'm going to move to is for Caroline, Carlo, and Renee. Actually, if any of you want to take it, if a victim service provider already partners with a local continuum of care, can the victim service agency enter into a Surfa MOU for additional vouchers? So does this new EHV program require a separate MOU, or how would that work for them if they're already partnering with a continuum of care?
Go ahead, Caroline.
Okay. And please fill in if I'm missing something here. So the PHA has to enter into an MOU with a COC. If the PHA is going to receive referrals separately from an organization, they would then also need to be in an MOU with that organization. It could be a separate MOU, or it could be an additional signer to the MOU between the PHA and the COC that may specify that there may be some direct referrals for some reason. So you kind of have a lot of, I think, leeway there.
Awesome. The next question is around the service fee. So one of the participants shared that it sounds like their local PHA are planning to keep the $3,500 service fee per voucher for landlord incentives. Is there anything about that that's in violation of regulations?
Well, you know, the $3,500 per voucher, it's clear in the guidance that part of what that needs to be used for is housing search assistance. Now that is being defined very broadly. And the way it's listed out, it actually looks like it's separate from owner incentives, but in my mind, it falls under the category of housing search assistance, as well as some other things that are listed out separately. So it's a little bit confusing. But you know, one thing that is clear is that, you know, the housing search assistance has to include assistance to pay to help people lease up. Right. So whether that comes in the form of owner assistance, owner incentives, or the actual going out and outreach, which I think a lot of victim service providers that are also housing providers and that are already in the game of working with landlords and owners and providing assistance to them, like those folks are in perfect position to help with this housing search assistance. So, you know, even though victim service providers cannot be paid through the services fee to be referral partners, they can be paid to provide housing search assistance. And, you know, we've been recommending that if there are these arrangements for victim service providers to provide housing search assistance, that those arrangements, as well as the related compensation, as well as description of the roles, are in the MOUs that are being executed.
Thank you. The next one is around, as a victim service provider, so specifically as a human trafficking organization, can they be a voucher provider? And I'll turn that over to Caroline. Or if not, what does that partnership look like then?
So the only organizations that were invited to administer emergency housing vouchers are public housing authorities that already had a voucher program. That being said, victim service providers can partner with their local PHAs, either within the kind of context of the partnership between the local COC and the PHA, or else if there's no connection between that trafficking organization and the COC, the trafficking organization could partner directly with the PHA to send referrals of individuals or families.
Great, thank you. The next question, if we can start with Renee, and then also Carlo and Caroline, feel free to jump in, is it's not uncommon for human trafficking victims who were forced to recruit for their trafficker to have to be registered as a sex offender. So is there any workaround to be able to show that it was under duress while a victim of human trafficking, so that sex offender registry ended up happening due to their labor trafficking, or excuse me, their human trafficking situation?
So just to make sure I have the question right. So the survivor is registered as is on a lifetime sex registration list.
Yeah, and that would be due to their situation in human trafficking. So as a result.
Yeah, so I feel like that's probably a question for HUD, because so basically being on a state lifetime sex offender registration list is one of the mandatory exclusions. And so I'm not sure exactly how to, if there's a way to demonstrate. Caroline, do you have thoughts on that? Because I'm not sure.
Yeah, so there's not a way. Unfortunately, the statutory language that surrounds the mandatory ban on individuals who are subject to a registration requirement under a sex offender law statute is it's just a straight out ban. There are other prohibitions in the voucher program that have some ability to look at circumstances, but the sex offender one is unfortunately not one of them. I will say in some states, there's an appeal process. I understand that appeal process can be incredibly onerous and difficult to do, but it would be worth looking at that, because the mandate from HUD is only if you're on that registration requirement, or if you have that registration requirement. So once that gets dropped, you are the person would be eligible for housing. But I'm sorry, that's not a very satisfying answer.
Yeah, and that's, definitely unfortunate knowing that a lot of survivors end up, having these long-term consequences due to exploitation that happened during their, their trafficking experience. I will say that, not as a ideal or quick solution, but Freedom Network does have a survivor reentry project that helps match up survivors with pro bono attorneys for a vacatur. And so that way they are able to vacate, some of those records that, the criminal records that happened due to their trafficking situation. So, that again, not an ideal or quick solution, but also just so, people today know that there's that potential resource if it's useful for y'all. Awesome. So we're gonna keep.
Oh, sorry. Oh, I just had one more thought. Sorry, Karen. Just make sure that it is the statute specifically addresses lifetime registration sex offenders. So that's an important point. It's so just make sure that the classification is a lifetime registration requirement. Sorry, Karen. Go ahead.
No, that's great. Thank you. Thank you for clarifying. The next question, Caroline, if you want to start off with this, is if the adult of the household does not have a legal status in the U.S., but the children have HHS eligibility, stating that they are trafficking survivors, is that family eligible for a voucher?
Yeah, well, it does not. They could be eligible. There are so many things that impact eligibility. I don't want to say it straight out they are, but what would happen is that the household would be assisted on a prorated basis. So the number of people in the household would then affect that have a legal status would be covered, but then it would be prorated so that federal assistance wasn't being paid for people that are not eligible, not in this country, or are not eligible for the assistance.
Thank you. Okay. There's another question similar that came into this, which was if survivors needed to receive HHS certification in a non-work social security number before being able to access emergency housing voucher. So Renee, I think that might be similar to kind of the T visa one. So this one's around HHS certification. If they need to, if individuals need to have received HHS certification and a non-work social security number before being able to access the vouchers.
So, so I think, the issue really is one helpful way to think about it is if the survivor would be eligible to apply for a Section 8 voucher in terms of immigration status, then they would be eligible here. So sorry, I was responding to another question, so I just want to make sure that I got the first part of the question. So we're talking about HHS certification. Are we talking about like a VAWA self-petitioner or something else?
Yeah, no, so I think this is specifically for human trafficking. If a HHS certification would be required prior to them being eligible for.
I can take this one, Renee, because
Yeah,
it's about
yeah,
documentation and verification. Right. So this relates back to the waiver, one of the major waivers for the emergency vouchers, which is that for immigration documentation, and which is also related social security number documentation, HUD has waived what is regularly required in the Section 8 program to now say you have 180 days to provide this documentation, whether that's for immigration or social security number, a work social security number, a non-work one. I know for non-work ones, it can take quite a while. So HUD is taking that into account. So you have essentially 6 months, but 180 days. And so you can have the voucher and be using it in a unit for quite a few months before having to actually produce it while the 180 days happen.
Thank you. The next question, Caroline, if you want to start with it, is if a former Section 8 housing choice voucher participant is alleged to own rent to a housing authority, are they required to enter into a repayment plan with the housing authority in order to be eligible for the emergency housing voucher?
So that's a really great question. I do not think that they can be required to enter into that repayment agreement. But I want to check on that before I say for sure. You can't, PHAs should not be able to not admit that person because of a prior debt. But I'm not sure about the requiring the payment plan. I think one thing I wanted to make sure I noted on this is that the EHV website on the HUD general website has a list of FAQs that we've been updating weekly. So that's a great place to look for some answers too. But let me just check on that.
Thank you. And I think this next question might be for you as well. It's around after the funding ends in 2030, can a family apply for a regular housing choice voucher or get on the list before 2030? That way they don't lose the assistance.
So that's a really good question. And we've also had discussions of that within HUD. So I think essentially, if you are issued and lease up with an EHV, the PHA still shouldn't be taking people off of their regular waiting list for that exact reason. I will say that I really encourage people to think of this as essentially a permanent housing solution, even though there is that 2030 date. For the most part, people do not actually stay on vouchers for an indeterminate amount of time. I think the average length of time on a voucher is like 5 or 6 years the last time I looked. But also there are ways that PHAs can make it so that we won't be terminating people in 2030. So certainly the PHAs cannot take them off that waiting list, but also it isn't, I think we're required to say, obviously, because they are not funded past 2030, but I think there's a lot that can change in 9 years to make it so that there won't be this cliff at that point.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. And then a clarifying question was, does an individual, just to clarify, an individual does not have to reside in their jurisdiction of a PHA in order to apply for emergency housing voucher administered through that specific PHA. Is that correct? And I think, Caroline, you may have started typing.
I did, yeah. So there's no restrictions on if you have to live in the jurisdiction of the PHA at the time of being issued the EHV. I think one thing to remember is that these vouchers are being, in order to issue an EHV, the PHA has to receive a referral either from their local, the coordinated entry system or their partnering organizations. And probably those organizations and the coordinated entry system will be roughly following the jurisdiction, or will be looking for people that are living in that jurisdiction. So it isn't like the Housing Choice Voucher Program where you can put out your name on a large number of lists across the country. You have to have those relationships and be referred. So there certainly is not there's not a residency requirement under these, but it's a little bit more complicated than just being issued a voucher in order to get that referral.
Thank you. The next question, Carla and Renee, if you all want to give some ideas on it. So it says, do service providers sign an MOU, which Memorandum of Understanding, with the designated Continuum of Care or with the local housing authority? And also what would the housing authority's role look like in there?
So the answer is either. I mean, I think ideally if the victim service providers can work directly with the Continuum of Care, since there's already a Continuum of Care system in place, that would be best. And that if they could somehow work and be integrated into the coordinated entry system, that would be even better. But if that is not possible, then the victim service provider would be contracting directly with the housing authority. And in terms of, the scope of the role and what that would mean and the related compensation, the victim service provider would have to work with. I mean, definitely if it's referral would be part of it. But if also the local provider can provide housing search assistance to help survivors lease up, then that could be another part of the relationship that could also be encapsulated in the MOU.
Thank you. Another question, Carla, and I'll just stick with you on this one, but everyone feel free to chime in, is if a survivor did receive an emergency housing voucher, but with pending immigration documentation, would the voucher be terminated if they could not produce that documentation within the 180 days?
I think that's the gist of the HUD notice. You know, they're waiving it so that there's more time, but once that time comes, 180 days, and if there's still no verification about immigration status or social security number, then I think that per the notice, the voucher assistance would be terminated. But, you know, the thing is, you know, with folks who already get vouchers, there is a process you go through. You know, it's much harder to get someone off of assistance than it is to deny someone at the front before they receive assistance. So there is inherently some kind of process that you'd have to go through to make sure that the person does not have the right documentation.
Carlo, I just to jump in, because I just looked this up in the notice while you were answering the previous question. A couple of things from the notice that would be helpful. I agree with Carlo's assessment. The PHA can provide an extension. They do have that discretion if there's evidence that the family has been making a good faith effort to obtain the documentation. And then pending the appeal of secondary verification, then, you know, the assistance can't be terminated. But I agree with Carlo, like generally, but, you know, really try to work with PHAs to make sure that they are providing that extension in circumstances where folks are just not able to get the documents in that 180 days.
And I saw a follow up to this same thread in the chat. So it asks if they didn't submit the documentation within the 180 days, would the survivor or the individual have to pay back those prior 6 months of rent?
Sorry, I just typed this in the chat box. So the notice does say that if a PHA determines that an ineligible family received assistance, the PHA must take steps to terminate that family from the program. But it doesn't mention repayment, so I don't think there is that requirement.
Awesome, thank you. There was also a question, so it's kind of two that I'm gonna weave together. So the question here in the Q&A is there a requirement for the victimization to have occurred within the jurisdiction where the voucher is being used? And then what I'm going to add to that is specifically for human trafficking, there was a question earlier that I saw if the trafficking situation had to occur within the US, since there's, you know, many individuals that may have been experiencing that trafficking situation in their home country. So Carla, it seems like you're ready to go on that one.
The answer is no, because you know, the way that survivors are eligible are through the definitions of the various categories of violence. So that includes all the VAWA categories as well as the TVPA's definition of human trafficking. And in none of those definitions does it talk about any kind of geographic limitation as to where the violence occurred. And I believe in some of them it talks more about sort of trauma and, you know, the experience of that trauma as it continues. So the answer is no.
Great, thank you. We have a question that also came in around the referral process and what that could look like. And I will, you know, add that I think it can be, you know, dependent on what it looks like or what's needed for your community. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for you as a victim service provider, as an anti-trafficking program, to give input on what that could look like as you're collaborating with your continuum of care and with your public housing authority. But just more broadly, to put this out with our panelists, so what would a process look like for a referral? Would there be an actual form or a phone call, or, you know, is this going through like a public housing authority website? Any thoughts or ideas on what that could look like, or what you all have seen?
I mean, ideally, you know, we've been trying to share best practices. We're kind of, you know, building the ship as we're sailing. So we have been talking to different localities about what it looks like is working for them. And we're working with Continuums of Care, who are really, really focused on not only working with homeless populations, but also survivor populations. And, you know, one of the things that seems to be coming up, and it looks different from locality to locality, is creating a centralized system within coordinated entry, but doesn't have to be coordinated entry. It could just be within the continuum of care system that basically allows for these referrals coming from not just homeless folks, but also people working with survivors. So as part of that, what that means is that there are different victim survivors, service providers at the table that are all talking to each other and talking to the continuum of care to make sure that these referrals are all being funneled into the centralized system and is going to the COC that is then providing referrals to PHAs. So that's like the dream, right? that happens. But as we all know, there are many providers that are not part of that. They're not part of the COC, they're not part of coordinated entry. And so we're kind of trying to work within an imperfect system. And so if there are barriers to that for a whole host of reasons, then, you know, it would be better. I'm still encouraging localities to still try to work with other service providers, like, trafficking, sexual assault, domestic violence, work together to provide, because again, these folks are being viewed as essentially sort of a monolith and providing sort of like the survivor referrals. And that's not ideal, but, to the extent that folks can work together, I think it does make it more streamlined for the entire process and makes it easier for housing authorities to receive, those referrals from the survivor population using that one form that everyone is sharing.
That's a really good point. Thanks, Carlo. This question is for Caroline, and also Renee and Carlo, feel free to jump in. Is for those convicted of a criminal offense, is there a look back limit yet?
Yeah, so the notice does allow for an alternative requirement to be established that sets a look back limit of, I believe, 12 months. For criminal activity.
Great, thank you. And I'm just trying to look through, there were a lot of questions around if the slides were going to be shared. Yes, they will, as well as the recording and all of the resources that were mentioned throughout the presentation today. So we'll be sharing those. If you sign up for the webinar, you'll be receiving those in the next 2 weeks. And we did get a question if someone could send out documentation that would be needed for waivers for those with criminal records. Is that something that, that we have a link to or that we could attach to the follow-up email? I think, Renee, maybe you were starting to type something in there, or that could be accidental.
NHLP, we're actually working to put together, it's not fully baked yet, but I'm happy to share with Karen to really kind of narrow in on the criminal history waivers, because we know that's something that a lot of folks have questions about, but it's not ready for prime time yet. But I'm happy to share with Karen if it's helpful for folks. In the meantime, I would definitely just encourage folks to look at the notice and look at particularly the distinction between the mandatory prohibitions, which are very limited, and then permissive, as well as alternative requirements that are not allowed, or alternative bases related to criminal history that are not allowed for this program. But we're working on getting a resource that kind of summarizes all that. So sorry, it's not ready yet.
Can I also add, we've done a number of webinars at HUD around certain topics within the notice. One of those was for waivers. We just did that last Tuesday, June 1st. So all of the webinars we've conducted, we have recordings, but also the slides. So that might be a good resource to look at in the interim.
Yes, and Caroline just put the website on the chat box, so feel free to look at that, and we'll make sure to include the website with the follow-up email. The next question is, could a survivor who was trafficked 10 years ago be eligible, or is there a time frame limiting when the exploitation or when the trafficking happened? And I'll open that up to Renee, Carlo.
I don't believe there's a time limit, but Carlo, I don't.
No, it goes back to the definition of trafficking within TVPA. So I feel like, Karen, you're actually the best person to answer that in terms of, practically speaking, how that's played out, but I don't think so.
Yeah, the way that I've seen it play out is that it does not matter, especially because there are a lot of, due to trauma, obviously, there's a lot of long-term, effects that it ends up having, that trafficking situation ends up having, and it can continue to lead to housing instability for long times after, a individual exits a trafficking situation. So I've never seen the time frame necessarily come into play, unless somebody's trying to access like an emergency shelter, for example. So that wouldn't necessarily play out here. The next question, I believe this was already answered, was if the adult in the household does not have a legal status in the US, but the children have HHS eligibility, stating that they are trafficking survivors, is the family eligible for a voucher? And I believe from Caroline Firm, I believe you answered a similar question, and it is potentially, they would need to see their individual circumstances, but potentially they would be eligible. Perfect. And I'm just trying to see if there were any others that we missed. Let me just go through the chat box real quickly. I think I just went through all the ones in the question and answer box. I think we should be good there. So we're pretty close to time, but are there any, okay, I think there was one last one that came in. So I'm just gonna go ahead and read it as it was written in. So last time I tried to reach out to my Section 8 in community housing, they were at a halt and they had frozen everything due to COVID and were not accepting people into the list. What would be the best way to apply to get a family into this program?
So making those connections to the partnerships, if you have a connection to the coordinated entry system, that would be the best way to refer them over, or else if you have a connection with PHA and can enter into that MOU. I think probably if you have a family right now that you need to assist, I would recommend getting in touch with the coordinated entry system to try to get that referral over. The vouchers can be leased starting on July 1, 2021. I will say that COVID really shocked a lot of things, but definitely housing authorities, where a lot of the services and provisions needed to happen in person. You need to inspect units. There were a lot of things that did come to a halt at the beginning of COVID. That has hopefully loosened up somewhat, although we are now in a housing crisis. There's a lot of things going on. But I will say there should not be at this point COVID-related shutdowns of housing authorities in terms of issuing vouchers and getting places leased up. I will say they're probably still delayed, but they shouldn't be frozen at this point. So going through the partnerships and the referral process that we discussed and Carlo and Renee went over, I think are the best ways to get families who are victims of abuse to these resources.
Perfect, thank you. I think I saw a couple more questions that came in. So one was around, it was unclear, or they wanted a little clarification as to who the $3,500 service fee was paid to. So Carla, if you want to give a little clarification on how that can be used or who is paid towards.
Yeah, so the notice and the FAQs provide more information about who can receive those funds for the services fee. So the housing authority basically has discretion. So long as the housing search assistance is being provided, the housing authority has the discretion to either hire their own staff and pay for someone who can provide those services, or they can contract out with other providers, including victim service providers, to provide that housing search assistance. So that part for sure, if there are providers on this call today who already have experience working with landlords, have done a lot of outreach, especially if you're working with certain populations where housing is hard to find for them. And so there are some providers already on the ground who have relationships with landlords, and that could be a way to essentially get survivors who have the vouchers to get them leased up. Then I would definitely present that to the housing authority as an option, as, hey, I'm already doing this. I can really help you facilitate survivors leasing up because I have these contacts, and no one else in the community has these contacts, which is very unique for certain survivor providers. So I would definitely do that and have that be encompassed in the MOU. And then obviously providers can be compensated for their services.
Great, thank you. And then finally, can you, all Renee and Carlo and Caroline, can you all just give a rundown of what the upcoming deadlines are? So you all mentioned July 1st and July 31st. That way people have a sense of what those mean for them.
Sure. So as of July 30 or July 1st, that's when the PHAs can start issuing and leasing up vouchers, meaning they can be reimbursed for the costs of that. HUD is requiring that every PHA that received vouchers enters into an MOU or a Memorandum of Understanding by July 31st. But in order to get the referrals over to start leasing as quickly as possible, we really encourage those MOUs to be in place as soon as possible. One thing to keep in mind is that the MOUs can be a living document. So if you can get something in place to just get that first group of people to start leasing up, you can always expand on that MOU or tweak it to make sure it's meeting the needs that you're seeing in your community.
Thank you. Fantastic. So we're going to go ahead and go to the next slide. Again, thank you all for joining us. We know that there was a lot of information that was covered today, so we'll make sure to send the next, in the next week or two, we're going to go ahead and send you the recording, the slides, and as well as all of the links that were shared today and all the resources to make sure you have those available. We do have our email, training@freedomnetworkusa.org, that you can reach out to us. We're also happy to connect you with Renee and Carlo. And then also Caroline mentioned that there's the EHV at HUD.gov email. So that way, if you're running into challenges connecting with them, please reach out. There's also virtual office hours that Caroline just put in the chat that HUD is hosting around this. So please, we really encourage you to make that connection. We know that, for anti-trafficking providers, there might be a difference in familiarity with both continuums of care and public housing authorities. And also this is a really critical resource for survivors of trafficking. And we want to ensure that as victim service providers, as anti-trafficking programs, that we're really pushing to make those connections so that way survivors are not left out, that they really have meaningful access to this. So if you could go to the next slide, you'll have the our website, and also I don't think I can go to the next slide. Thank you. In our so it has both our website, where you'll find the resource library that will have both this recording as that's put up, and also a lot of different links and resources